Welcome to the second part of the 2.1 lecture for Statistics 2023. My name is Jorge Young. So for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the example, the raw data that we were presented to in the lecture. And I'm going to show you how to create a frequency distribution table. We're also going to do a relative frequency and also cumulative frequency. And then once you see it, you'll understand what I meant by the table that I showed in the publisher PowerPoint is actually incorrect. So I'm going to go through some formulas, and then so the nice thing about these videos is that you can stop them, just go ahead and do it on your own. You'll have access to this file and repeat the process. That's really the way that you're going to learn how to do the Excel portion for this particular course. So the first thing that I have is I have all of my data points. So I got 50 points. And so what I like to do is I like to go ahead and find a minimum, and I'm going to go ahead and use this formula in Excel. So if you notice, what I do is I type equal min, and then I do open parentheses. And then what you do at this point is just you can highlight your raw data, and then what that's going to do is going to give you the minimum value of all the points. And so the minimum value we have is 83, and we already knew that from the previous video. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and find a maximum value. So you can tell I can just go ahead and type in equal max and then open parentheses. This is not the only way of doing it. There are other ways of doing this. And throughout the course, I'll show you different ways of finding these values. So the next step, if you remember back from the previous video, we found the difference between the max and the min. That's what we call the range. They didn't call it the range in the lecture because we have not introduced that yet, but that's what it is. So if I take the max value and subtract the minimum value from it, the difference is the range. So all I have to do is type in equal. And so whenever you're going to do a formula in Excel, you have to type in equal first. And I can just simply click on the cell that I want to, the two cells that I want to subtract. And if you notice, so it's going to be the cell D2 minus C2, and that's going to give me the difference between the max and the min. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the width. I am going to use 5 classes. So what happens here is I'm going to take the range and I'm going to divide it by 5, and that's going to give me 45. Now we knew that already because the previous video. Now I did mention that in the lectures they go up to 50. I just think that's too much, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to 46. So they did two things differently. They chose a value that's less than the min, and they also rounded up by 5. And I mean, you can do that, but you don't really need to do all that. So now I'm going to create my lower class limit. So I always start off with my minimum value. That's just the way that I like to do it. And then what's going to happen is that to this minimum value here, the 86, I'm going to add the width that I'm going to use, which is the 46. If you don't round this up, what happens is when we do create the class boundaries, we're going to miss this max point. So that's why we round up always. And so now that I have 83 plus 46 gives me 129, I can repeat the process, or I can just simply drag it. Now I need 6 points since I'm doing 5 classes, so that's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so these are these are my lower class limits. And you can see I have my 5 points. My 6 points. You're gonna see why we need the 5 points. All I'm going to do is I'm just gonna go ahead and type these in. I can just copy them over, and I'll show you that in class. And so the next thing is, now I have to do my upper class limits. And so if you remember what they did with the upper class limits, is they simply subtracted 1 from the next lower class limit. So I have 128, 174, 220, 266, and then this one's going to be 312. And that's why I need my 6 points. So I used the first 5 points or class limits that I found for my lower. I subtract 1 from the next lower class limit to create my previous upper class limit, and then this becomes my 6th value. Now, class boundaries. What happens here is that if you notice, we do have a gap. We have a gap between 128 and 129, 174 and 175, so we want to eliminate that gap. And the easiest way to eliminate that gap is to do the following. Now, we're using integers here. So if I have integers, what I have to do is to the lower class limit, I just subtract 0.5. And then to the upper class limit, I add 0.5. Now, if you think about it for a second, if I subtract 0.5 from 129, I'll get 128.5. And instead of retyping this every single time, I'm just going to go ahead and drag it. And if you notice now, my first class goes from 82.5 to 128.5, then 128.5 to 174.5, 174.5 to 220.5, 220.5 to 266.5, and then 266.5 to 312.5. So several things. 82.5 is less than my minimum, which means the minimum is going to be counted. 312.5 is greater than my max, which means my max is going to be counted. So you always want your classes to be exhaustive. In other words, you want every single data point to be included when you create your table. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and find the frequency. Again, this is not the only way to do this, and I will go over this in class, but there's a formula that I like to use, and it's called COUNTIF. So equal COUNTIF. Now, there's two pieces of criteria that I need. The range, which is your raw data, and I'm just going to go ahead and include that. And then the next thing is I want to use this formula here, and then I'm going to go ahead and put K2. The reason I put K2 is because K2 is it's blocking my formula, it's blocking my K2. K2 is your upper class boundary. So the first part of the formula is COUNTIF, open parentheses, wherever your raw data is, and then we use these symbols to finish off the formula. And this is just a way that Excel recognizes what we're trying to do. This is not a coding class. This is not an Excel class. So the best thing to do is just say, okay, if I do this, I can count all of these values. Now, there are other features in Excel that will do this for you, but what I've seen is that it misses points. And so if you submit something and you're missing data points, you're going to lose points on your final grade. So you might as well just, don't try to cut corners and just get it done right. So now I repeat the process again. Now I'm just going to type in my range is, because I already know it goes from A2 to A51. And then the next one I'm going to do is my lower class, which is J2. And then I'm going to go ahead and press enter. So here's my formula. And what this is telling Excel is, say, hey, I want you to count every single data point that's less than 128.5. Then I want you to count every single data point that's less than 82.5. And then I want you to subtract those two. So obviously we know there's nothing less than 82.5, and that's going to be 0. But everything less than 128.5 is 13 data points. 13 data points are less than or equal or less than 128.5. And so I want to drag this. But before I drag this, I have to tell Excel, I'm going to drag this, but I want you to only look at A2 to A51. And so look what happens. If I just drag it without doing something first, I get A3 to A52. So what happens is it's not counting this one. It's not even looking at this one anymore, right? Because it started at A3. And if I drag it again, now it went from A4 to A53. So unless we tell Excel, look, I want you to just look at these cells, don't just start skipping stuff, we have to do something, right? I'm going to go ahead and delete this. So I go back to the original. I highlight where my raw data is, and I just go ahead and hit F4. And what F4 does, or the function and then F4, the function key and then F4, is that it puts dollar signs around the cells. And when I put the dollar signs, what this tells Excel is, I don't want you to change this. I want you to keep this the same. I'm only looking at this range of cells. Now the K2 and J2 will change. It will change to K3, J3, K4, J4, and that's okay because I want it to look at these different values as I drag down. And then you can see here, right? So the only thing that's changing are my upper class and my lower class boundaries. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to find a sum because I know that I have 50 data points, and so when I have everything counted, I want to have 50. And so I'm good to go. Right, so that's how we create a frequency distribution table. The next thing is we're going to go ahead and create the relative frequency distribution table. And if you remember from the previous lecture, this is simply the raw count for each class divided by the total. Now, I could have easily just clicked on the cell that has 50, but if I did that, I would have had to put the dollar signs around it. Otherwise, it would have changed it when I drag it. And so 26% of all the data points are in my first class, are between 82.5 and 128.5. And 44% are between 128.5 and 174.5. Now, when I drag all this down, and then when I add it up, I should get 1, right? Because it should be 100% of everything that I have. And this is how we create the relative frequency distribution table. Then the last thing we're going to do in this video is the cumulative frequency distribution. And so this is just going to be equal to that first class, right? Because 26% are in the first class. Now, cumulative means that whatever this value is going to be simply the sum of these two. And so the way that I like to do it is I just click on the previous one, but then I also click on the one that's next to it, the one where I'm going to put my final value. So 26% are less than 128.5. 70% are less than 174.5. And if I drag this, 90% are less than 220.5. 96% are less than 266.5. And then this last one should be a 1. Why? Because 100% of all of the data points are less than 312.5. And that makes sense because we know that our max value is 308. And so that's how we create a frequency distribution table. And the next thing that we're going to do is going to go to section 2.2. Thank you.